What's going on there, guys? Today we're going to be converting this image taken by Logan Weaver of this dunk into a 3D animation, all from using PhotoMotion Horizon. We'll be first splitting our layers up and then setting our cage, and lastly creating a smooth animation all within After Effects. Okay, so the first step, as usual, is using Photoshop in order to split our layers and create our clean plate. So let's get to it. So we already have Weaver's photo in Photoshop, and what we're going to do first is just create a duplicate from this background layer so we have a copy that we can actually work on. The next step is just creating a mask of this player here using the quick selection tool. We'll be creating a very basic, simple layer from this guy, and don't worry about being too precise with the selection tool, as we'll be perfecting this in a second. Next, go to the select and mask button at the very top, just over here. Okay, what we'll need to do here is just create a finer mask of this guy and really hone in our edges. Quick selection tool is a great tool, although it's very rough. So just like Content Aware, we will need to do some adjustments. So just try using the brush tool on the side panel to get as close as possible with the edges, and then use the refine edge tool for the more difficult things like, say for example, hair. Okay, so once we're happy with this, let's just go to Output 2 just over here and then click on the drop down selecting New Layer with Mask. Okay, so with that done, we can now see that this guy is within a new layer. However, there's a duplicate underneath in a separate layer, and what we'll need to do is remove that duplicate in order to have a really decent clean plate. First, let's get back our selection by holding Control and then clicking on this mask. We'll then need to disable this top layer and then enable the bottom layer here. We'll then expand our selection. We don't want Content Aware to lock onto our outline of this guy, and then we'll right click on the mask, ensuring that you have the selection tool selected, and then click on this fill. Okay, then with that done, just copy the settings we have over here, and we're going to be using Content Aware as said before, just to get the result that we have here. Looks pretty good, although we are picking up a few distortions here, but because of the way that we're going to be animating and the fact that our background is out of focus, it doesn't really matter too much. This is one of the reasons why it's important to have a small plan of action, as we could perfect this clean plate so it looks perfect, but there will be no point as we're really not going to see that within the final result. So with that done, let's get to using the selection tool again to mask out this hoop from the overall image. Problem with this hoop, as you can gather, will be these holes within the net. Now we're not going to get rid of all of them through the quick selection tool, so let's just go to select and mask in order to create this really clean mask. Okay, then with that done, let's go to this Output 2 and change it to New Layer with Mask. So once again, we'll need to remove this hoop from our clean plate behind it. So hold Alt and then click on the mask, then disable the actual layer, and then click the layer beneath in order to select it. So with that done, as before, let's expand our mask, setting the range here to around about 15 pixels. So again, we're going to use Content Aware to get rid of this hoop. So right click, then go to Fill, and as long as you're happy with your settings, hit OK. Right, so we want to do some cleaning up, but nothing too much. Just use the clone stamp tool to get rid of a majority of these small hiccups left behind from Content Aware, and for any of those larger areas, we can use the patch tool just over here. Cool, it's really coming along now. So let's rename our layers to avoid any confusion with an After Effects. So let's just make sure to save this somewhere convenient. Just make sure that when you save this project, place it somewhere where it's not going to get moved or shuffled about. Otherwise, we're going to run into a very pesky missing message from After Effects. Okay, so with the Photoshop part of the tutorial over, let's get to PhotoMotion. So with PhotoMotion, as most of you are probably aware, it's a portable application. You'll just need to double click on the file here, which will bring you into the start screen. No additional plugins or scripts, just double click on the project and you're set to go. Okay, so in order to import our picture, what we're going to do is we're just going to go to the desktop where we saved our Photoshop file, drag and drop it into our After Effects project, and then where it says import kind, just make sure it's set to composition. We really don't want all of these layers to merge back together. Since it is a viewport based application, most of our work within PhotoMotion is done within the viewport, of course, and the effect controls panel. So with that being said, just click on this Start Horizon button over here, and that will bring us into the main dashboard. What we'll be doing here is just clicking on this Add Photo button over here, and then we'll drag our clean plate into this composition. We'll then parent it to this layer above whilst holding Shift. This part is important, and that will become evident in the other layers, and then we'll scale and position it using the layer above, not the base Photoshop layer, and that's because we can copy these attributes from the layer above across the whole entire project, saving us quite a lot of time and energy. Okay, back in the dashboard, we have this controller which morphs our 3D cage. What in essence this is a 3D representation of our scene, and while our image is fairly straightforward, with others you may have to add some rotation to some of these panels here. In any case, with our cage set up, let's get to sorting out our aspect ratio and export resolution nice and early within our project. We can do do this by just going over to the resolution button on the main dashboard and then navigating over to effect controls and changing this aspect ratio to portrait. We can also change this export resolution here by changing this 1080p into 4K. Quick disclaimer, by doing so you won't actually change your preview resolution on the main viewport, so you won't see any project slow down if you change this option, which is pretty neat. Okay, so with all of that said and done, let's get to layer 2 and import our first layer, this guy here, and parent it to the layer above whilst holding shift, and that will scale it accordingly. So we can also do the same here with the hoop, bring it into the project and then scale it just by parenting it to the top layer whilst holding shift, which will copy these attributes that we gave to the background just earlier. So even though we've done that, we're still actually not limited in terms of moving these layers independently within the project. We don't need to go back to Photoshop, of course, to do this. Just select the actual base Photoshop layer and then move the positioning. Don't do this to the layer at the very top where we've been parenting to, otherwise that's going to move the whole entire project, which of course we don't exactly want. So back in the main dashboard now, we can see that our layers here have fitting quite nicely. Because we don't see this guy's feet, we really don't need to pin him in position or have him locked into place. In saying that, let's get to importing our next layer, and we can do that by just clicking on this layer 4, import, and finally we have this countdown clock over here on our desktop, which we want to use for our main animation. Ticks down from 3 seconds to none, which is pretty neat. So just a quick case in point, you're really not limited in terms of still layers. We'll just drag it in here, and since it's not part of our overall Photoshop project, just scale and position it manually using the actual layer attributes itself. Back at the main dashboard, we'll just move into the animation part of this tutorial by going to this animate button, and then within effect controls, we'll tick this checkbox, show controls animation. Next, we'll just change our frame count to time by going down here to these units and then holding control, then clicking on the numbers. Then we'll make sure that our time head is at the 5 seconds point and then mark out in order to have a clearer vision of what our timeline is. So with our playhead at the right spot, let's get to creating our animation by clicking on this magnifying glass on our main controller and adding some zoom here. We'll then move our controller into position and then add some vertical movement by clicking on this icon over here at the bottom of the controller and adding some upwards movement by dragging this slider up. Okay, so with that done, let's get to moving our controller further and then adding some movement to the right. We'll also set the multiplier to around about 30. So if we click on the left side of the controller, we can also add in some tilt too and change that tilt intensity by just changing the multiplier. Okay, so on to the next part of this tutorial, setting up this dunking movement. What we want to do is just give this guy some extra bit of movement during our animation, giving this scene a little bit of life. Okay, so let's get started with that by just jumping into layer 1 where we put the player and the hoop. First, let's just make some adjustments to our hoop here so it's in the left top hand corner of the screen and therefore a little bit out of our main animation. We'll then bring our time head to the 5 seconds point and mark out. So why 5 seconds? Well, our main animation length, if you remember before, is 5 seconds, so we'll need to time any additional animations to that exact point, otherwise it won't time right. After doing so, let's see about adding in some movement on this player here and the hoop. So click on both layers and then press P in order to bring up their positioning attributes. Let's drag our needle back to the beginning of the composition and then click on the stopwatch here to begin animating and create these beginning keyframes. We'll then move our playhead to the 5 seconds point and then we'll move this player and the hoop here so they kind of move towards each other and create this kind of movement. Okay, so we'll also want to add some rotation to this player here to help sell this movement. Only the player's layer selected, hit R to bring up the rotational values, and then bring your needle back to the beginning of this composition. Then click on the stopwatch to create this keyframe here, and then drag your needle back to the 5 seconds point, and let's create some rotation so it kind of looks a little bit more better. Cool, so this is coming together really nicely, but we'll need to change all of these keyframes over to easing, so select all of the keyframes and then hit F9 on your keyboard, and that will convert these linear ones to these easing ones, which creates a far smoother movement. Okay, so now on to creating some of these puppet points. Bring your needle to the very beginning of the timeline, and then with only the player's layer selected, click on the puppet tool just up here, and then start creating some of these points along where there are places of connections. So say for example the legs over here, the torso, the shoulders, and the arms, head, and ball. Okay, so we're also going to change this image ever so slightly at the very beginning. We'll then move our needle to the 5 seconds point and create some more exaggerated movement, but still nothing too big. More often than not, subtlety reality is the best way to go. Right, so with our movement done, let's look at how things are coming along. Very nice. Okay, so checking this out, there's one small problem here. We're not really seeing enough movement on his hair, which in reality would be moving with him, so this animation just looks a little bit strange. If we want to add further points, just bring your needle to the very beginning and add it here, after which move it to the 5 seconds point and then add the movement that you think it should have. So once again, just make sure to convert these new keyframes that we've created to easing so they fit this animation and the overall main one. Just hit U on the keyboard, then select all of these keyframes and then hit F9 to convert them to easing. Now you may have noticed that on the ball here that we're picking up a slight distortion on the end, and we'll need to fix that in order to make sure that it looks as immersive as possible. So at the beginning of the animation, just add a puppet point at the bottom side of the ball and then bring your time head to the 5 seconds point. You'll notice that it's not exactly ideal, but since this puppet point now exists, we have the opportunity to morph the ball back in its original position. So let's morph it so it looks a little bit better, but we can still see that even once we've done with the hand, the ball here, there's still a little bit of distortion, so it doesn't look exactly clean. So we'll repeat this process again, as said before, by bringing our needle to the start, adding that point, then bringing our playhead to the 5 seconds point, and then readjusting that point and the other so it looks a little bit better. So once again, just make sure to convert these new keyframes that we've created to easing so they fit this animation and the overall main one. So let's just pop back to the main dashboard, have a look, make sure to change our puppet tool for the selection tool, and then we can spot there's actually two problems now. One of which is that our hoop isn't actually positioned correctly, but the other one being that the top of the hoop itself is actually cut out. We can fix that of course by going back to the layer that we were just in, and we spotted this problem while our playhead was at the very end of our animation to just make sure it's in the exact same position as it was in the main dashboard. Then we're going to change the positioning of the actual hoop so it fits within our main animation, and then we're going to get fixing this cutoff at the very top of the hoop here by just applying a repeat tile effect from the effects and presets tab. Okay, so let's just navigate over to effect controls and then ramp up this expand up attribute whilst also changing the tiling option here to unfold in order to make sure it just mirrors out upwards. Okay, great so far. Let's also add some depth of field onto here just to make it that more dynamic. So back over to the main dashboard, then bringing our playhead to the 5 seconds point, and then click on the animation button over here and then navigate over to the depth of field checkbox within effect controls and just click it. With our blur strength on the condition that our playhead is at the very end of the animation, just bring it up to 20, and what that will essentially do is just animate this blur in so it gradually increases with our animation. Now we're still not seeing anything, and that's because we need to tell Photomotion what layer we want to focus on. In our case it's layer 2 where this guy and the hoop reside, so after clicking on that we're now seeing this really nice blur effect come into play. Next we're just going to look into adding some particles by going over to settings on the main dashboard and then clicking on this activate particles checkbox just over here within effect controls. So these aren't really that appropriate for the scene that we're going for, so let's change them using the particle type slider. This looks alright, kind of suits the scene that we're trying to make rather quite nicely. So the problem that we're having now is that these particles are kind of blocking our subjects in terms of the foreground's positioning. So select the close button just down here on the particles tab on the main dashboard and then change their x-axis attributes just over here within effect controls so we can have them slightly out of the way. We'll also do the same with our middle ones too, just go over here and then change this so they're a little bit out of the way, and then once we're happy we'll go for a preview. Looking really great so far, and that's probably ready for rendering now. With that just said, just click on the export button down here and that will bring us into the render screen. If you've never used Photomotion before or just confused, let me explain these numbers very quickly. This is the Photomotion Perfect Cut system. What this basically tells us is how many frames in our animation we need to render in order to have either no loops, 150 frames in this example, one loop, 300 frames in this example, two loops, 600 frames in this example, and so on and so on. Since we're seeing this in time and not frame count, it's not exactly clear, so let's just go over here, control click on this time code here and change it to measurements in frame. So if we type out 150 frames here, we can see that Photomotion Perfect Cut system is giving the green light for one loop, and that's just clarification that our time head is now at the right place for one loop. Now before you even think about rendering, just make sure to mark out the very end of your workspace. If you don't, you'll still end up rendering this whole entire timeline, so marking out is pretty essential. So with that being said, let's just bring this into Media Encoder so we can export out as an MP4 directly. You can also export out through After Effects, although unfortunately at the time of this recording it lacks to render out H.264 MP4 for now. Quite frustrating. Alternatively, you can render it out as a .mov and then bring it into Media Encoder to an MP4. Now as long as your format is is set to H.264, and of course you're happy with your settings, just hit the export button above and you're good to go. And there you have it. From start to finish, the animation is now complete. Looks pretty cool. So if you have any questions about the tutorial, please feel free to hit up the live chat, and we hope you enjoy your PhotoMotion journey. Until next time.